exist. We are globalizing. We are integrating. Well, I've got news for you. We're not globalizing. In fact, we're deglobalizing. And what we're discovering is that we were never globalized on more than a superficial financial level. What you're seeing reassert itself with a vengeance are those essential features of human identity: race, religion, language, and culture that overlap. In some cases are inextricably intertwined. And when you challenge those, you're in for a very long, exhausting, unrewarding fight. And most of what we engage in when we intervene overseas inevitably devolves into a fight against those elements. Future wars, what are they going to look like? Are they going to look like Iraq and Afghanistan? And my argument to you is no. Iraq and Afghanistan are at the end of a long 50-year period, actually not quite 50 years. It started in 1961, involving a series of altruistic interventions by the United States to export our notions of how the rest of the world should live at gunpoint. Began in 61 with President Kennedy. You remember his speech, "We'll bear any burden, go anywhere." We went to Vietnam, and we killed 2 million Vietnamese. We lost 50,000 plus men, and 10 years later, we left. What we're going to see in the 21st century are going to be wars about other things: energy needs and the wealth that they confer, water shortages, territory, wealth, power, influence. The wars of ideology are going to fall by the wayside, and we're back to an environment very similar to what we saw before World War I. And we're also going to be dealing with the continual fallout from the imperial legacies and bad decisions of the early 20th century that created monstrosities like Yugoslavia or Iraq, places that under normal circumstances would have never existed without Versailles. And you're going to see, finally, technology intervene in these conflicts in new ways that are going to compel us to change the way we do business. You've seen some already, robotics. We're not going to see dramatic change, but they are going to extend human potential, and they're going to influence the way we do business. Directed energy is going to come online sometime over the next 20 years, and we're going to see aircraft flying at 35,000 feet that lose their wings and vanish because of directed energy air defenses. These things are coming. Next slide. Now, let's back up a little bit. We've been operating in a very strange environment. We've been facing, for the most part, peoples who were never really in a position to seriously challenge us. The last war of decision in the Clausewitzian sense that really changed the world strategically, had a profound impact on the map, that made us a superpower, if for no other reason because everyone else was hopelessly exhausted at the end of it, was World War II. That was your last war of decision. All the conflicts we've been involved with since then were not decisive in any way. Did not fundamentally change history, the direction of it. And some people would argue they certainly drained us from time to time of resources and capability, but there was no fundamental change in the international system as a result. And under those circumstances, we began to adopt this altruistic imperialist philosophy that said that, we are the exceptional people. We are the special nation that is going to bring to mankind all of these great gifts. And anyone who stood up and suggested perhaps it was a bad idea ran into trouble. And we have developed over the years inside our military establishments, and I would argue inside the Beltway in Washington, this sort of climate of conformity. So if someone asks hard questions, even if they're a journalist at a press conference, they're shunned. You can't ask the Secretary of Defense a question like that. What's wrong with you? And that goes on. So you get these very nice encounters where nothing is really questioned. And that's been a problem for us. It was a problem on our way into Vietnam, and it's been a problem since 9/11 because we don't ask these three questions. No one in the Senate or the House says, Mr. Secretary, General so-and-so, what is the purpose of this military operation? What's the purpose? Can you explain it? By the way, what are the forces you want to use, and why are they the right forces? Are you sure you have the right force mix? Are these the right tools? In fact, is military power at all the right solution for this particular problem? And then finally, when you're through with this, what do you want it to look like? What's the end state? And by the way, is that an attainable end state? Telling us that we are going to transform Afghan society or Arab society in Iraq to this sort of gleaming replica of Western-style governance and social democracy sounds great. Is it attainable? I mean, have you got the conditions conducive to the emergence of this wonderful utopian structure that you want to build? Next slide. Now the question is, how does globalization affect the forces that we have? In other words, what are we doing with them, and why do they actually exist? The reason I'm talking about general purpose forces is that there's a widespread sort of new conventional wisdom. We don't need general purpose combat power anymore. We don't need fleets of surface ships. We may not need large numbers of nuclear attack submarines. We don't necessarily need bomber wings. We don't necessarily need large combat formations, particularly armored forces. No one is going back to basics and saying, well, why do we maintain these forces to begin with? And this is important because we really maintain our military power as a strategic hedge against the possibility that we may have to fight a war we don't want to fight. I know this may come as a surprise to many of you, but wars can be very destructive to your prosperity. When you go to war, the idea is if you have to go to war, you try to achieve an outcome that is in your interest, and you try to end it on the best terms that you can get as quickly as possible. Because waging war is not economically beneficial. This is why Eisenhower ended the Korean War as quickly as he did on the best terms that he could get. It wasn't in the interest of the American people for this war to drag on and people to be killed in a remote part of the world where our interests were limited. In the event of war, we maintain these powerful conventional forces as a strategic, to get a strategic decision that we like, as a wedge, if you will, for some strategic leverage. We want to maintain enough of this power to secure our vital interests, but we don't necessarily want to maintain so much military power that we begin to frighten people around the world and create the impression that we represent a serious danger to them, because that kind of development tends to precipitate the emergence of new military alliances against you. Now, your historians, go back to the Peloponnesian War and Thucydides. Look at the alliances that ultimately emerge against the Athenians. Look at the alliances that emerge over time against the Germans. Go back to the Congress of Vienna in 1814, 1815, to von Humboldt, the Prussian representative, who brought all of the German-speaking representatives together and said, whatever happens as a result of this Congress, it is not in the interest of the German-speaking peoples to be united into one great nation. Because if we were, we would constitute such a power in terms of industry, agriculture, science, technology, that we would frighten our neighbors and precipitate a war with them. Imagine that kind of thinking. Very enlightened for a Prussian in 1814, 1815 to think in those terms. The point is, we need to be concerned about that, of people's perceptions, or you will see alliances that you never expected to happen. I encourage you to get on the internet and Google something called the Shanghai Cooperation Society, or whatever it's called, SCC, I think, Shanghai Cooperation something or other. All of these states in Central Asia, including Russia, Iran, and China, ostensibly for the purpose of energy. But the real discussions behind the scenes are keeping us out of their business and their countries. The Shanghai Cooperation Council. The last point. Historically, we have not maintained general purpose forces for the purpose of conquering and transforming other people's societies into reflections of our own. This is a very new development of the last 30, 40, 50 years. That's not why we maintain those forces. We need to go back and re-examine that. Next slide. What do we do with special operations forces? Well, special operations forces can be a very useful tool, particularly when you're not involved in a war, a general war, or a war against an existential threat,